I'm Tom Sutcliffe. I'm volunteering with the Roots to Roots project run by the Edinburgh and Lothians Regional Equality Council, ELREC, and I will be discussing the history of the relationship between Scotland and Poland with Professor Robert Frost of Aberdeen University. And Professor Frost, would you like to say anything about your own sort of interest in this area and how you came to it?
Certainly. I was born and brought up in Edinburgh, so I know the city very well. And while I was studying history at the University of St Andrews, I became interested in Polish history, partly because it struck me at the time that the history of Poland, or to be more precise, the history of Poland and Lithuania, had remarkable similarities to the history of Scotland and England in the period between about 1500 and 1800, which was what I was studying. I went to Poland in 1979 on a summer school and decided to write my PhD on Polish history. Came back, did that in the University of London, and have been lucky enough to be able to pursue my interest ever since.
A question I'm interested to hear your views on is how the fact that Bonnie Prince Charlie's mother was Polish has affected the way people in Scotland and Poland have considered their respective situations, and whether or not the shared history of that and things more generally has actually had either a conscious or an unconscious influence on the decision of groups of Poles or Polish individuals to come to Scotland and settle?
Well, I think I can answer that by saying very little. Funnily enough, I think that my experiences, and I've looked quite closely at the Charles Edward Stuart recently, is that very few Scots actually realise that Bonnie Prince Charlie's mother was Polish. Klementyna Sobieska, who was a Polish princess, the granddaughter of John III Sobieski, who liberated Vienna in 1683 during the Great Turkish Siege. I think there's a vague idea that Bonnie Prince Charlie was sort of French, although he actually grew up in Italy rather than France. But no, his mother was Polish. When I was asked the question, when I was applying for money to go on a summer school to Poland in 1979, I was asked at my interview, can you think of any historical links between Scotland and Poland? I didn't know. And somebody said, well, you know that Bonnie Prince Charlie's mother was Polish. And I said, oh yes, when actually I was thinking, no, actually I didn't know that, which I think is fairly common. And the Polish aspect of Bonnie Prince Charlie is actually quite interesting because the money of his Polish relatives, the Sobieskis, was crucial. The dowry that was paid to James, the Old Pretender, or James III if you are a Jacobite, for the marriage in 1719, it was never paid in full, but bits of it were paid, was quite extensive. And when Klementyna's father, Jakub Sobieski, was dying in the mid-1730s, the whole question of the vast Sobieski inheritance came up, and there was a question of whether Charles Edward Stuart would take out Polish citizenship so that he could inherit the Sobieski estates, which were extremely substantial. And it was decided that he shouldn't take out Polish citizenship. It might compromise him in his bid for the British throne. But still, when Jakub Sobieski died, the young princes, Charles and his brother Henry, did get quite a large financial settlement, without which I don't think Bonnie Prince Charlie could have laid the foundations for the 45 rebellion. So there was a very important historical background to this. And yet, because, shall we say, historians of Jacobitism tend on the whole not to read Polish, not much of this comes out in the actual history, and there is a great deal to learn about the relation. James Stuart writes regularly to his father-in-law and money lies at the heart of this a lot of the time. In Poland, I'm not sure how many Poles really realise that Bonnie Prince Charlie was half Polish. Sometimes when I tell them this, they are surprised. Then I say, oh, his mother was a Sobieska. Oh, yes, of course. But one of the reasons I think that this doesn't feature so highly is one of the reasons why from the mid-17th century, Polish and Scottish relations start to drift apart, and it's religious. In the 16th century, there's a great interest in Poland, in Scotland and in England, because Protestantism, largely Calvinism, but also anti-Trinitarianism, spreads very rapidly in Poland after about 1550, for about 20 years. At one point, half of the Polish Senate and a considerable number of the deputies to the lower house of the Polish Parliament are Protestants. Now, we don't think of Poland as being in any sense a Protestant country, but the Polish Protestants unite in 1570 in Sandomierz, and they create a joint confession of faiths, sort of. And this is a model which greatly interests Protestants in England and Scotland, struggling with their own different versions of the Protestant faith. The anti-Trinitarianism of Poles becomes very interesting later on to what becomes Unitarianism in Britain. But in Poland from the 1570s, the Protestant tide begins to turn. And the Republic, this noble Republic, Catholicism, counter-Reformation Catholicism, spearheaded by the Jesuits, begins to take over. And so you have many Orthodox nobles who'd originally been of Ruthenian background become Catholics down in what is now Ukraine. You have Protestants going back to Catholicism. And by the mid-17th century, Poland is seen as a Catholic power. And so Protestant Scots lose interest. Catholic Scots, like some of the Gordon family, Patrick Gordon, for example, from Ellon, who can't study at the University of Aberdeen because he's a because he's a Catholic, goes to Poland and spends 5 years in Poland and ends up in Russia as a general for Peter the Great. But that separates the two powers. And of course, Charles Edward Stuart is Catholic, and the Catholic, Jacobitism is now tremendously popular among modern Scots. But in fact, in the 17th and late 17th and 18th century, the Stuarts' Catholicism is a great barrier to most of lowland Scotland with regard to a Stuart restoration. So there are historical reasons why I think there's no greater realization of Bonnie Prince Charlie's Polish heritage. But I'm hoping to change that myself. I'm currently researching a portrait in the National Portrait Gallery in London, which was once claimed to be, or was left to the Portrait Gallery in 1922 as a portrait of Charles Edward Stuart in Polish dress, painted around 1735. All the experts on Stuart portraiture says it is not him. I'm not so sure, but this is something that needs to be investigated. I'm working on this at the moment.